Respected senior colleagues and dear friends, welcome to API Kochi Meet for the month of July 2021. So today's session, we had two important topics in academics. The first is on an SGLT2 inhibitor, dapagliflozin. Now, all of us are aware that probably if there is any molecule which can qualify to be declared as the molecule of the decade or even century, that is SGLT2 inhibitor. To speak on this topic, we have the eminent endocrinologist, Dr. Jeevan Joseph. And we are also lucky to have Dr. Sinesh Chandra, who has graciously agreed to chair this first session all the way from Brunei. And thank you, Dr. Sinesh. And for the second half of the academics, we have a panel discussion. Again, a very fascinating topic. That's on cocktail and elixir to life. An eminent group of panelists will be deliberating on this topic. And Dr. Sheetal Bino, Senior Consultant Physician at Sunrise Hospital, will be chairing this second session. Now, may I request Dr. Sinesh Chandra to please take over the dais and start the first academic session. Dr. Sinesh, please.
Thank you, Dr. Radhakrishnan, sir. Yeah, it has been a pleasure to be with you all again. And thank you for this opportunity, Dr. Radhakrishnan, Dr. Sheetal, and the entire team of API Kochi for giving me this opportunity. I think we have excellent academic event in the evening. So the first session of the talk is, as Dr. Radhakrishnan has already pointed out, it's on SGLT2 inhibitors, when, where, and how. I think it has revolutionized the field of internal medicine and diabetes as a whole. And now initially nowadays we are confused whether who is using it, whether it's cardiologists are using it more following the EMBARAC outcome trial, or physicians and diabetes people are using it, or the nephrologists are using. So it has become everyone's favorite. So at certain point of time, we do know whether there are sometimes whether we are on the correct lines on starting it, what are the guidelines telling us to when to start it, where to start it, and how to start it, and how to stop it. So all these things are relevant topics of today. I think to discuss on this current relevant topic, we have a very young and enthusiastic speaker from Kottayam, Dr. Jeevan Joseph. He is an upcoming endocrinologist in Kottayam. So he is the director of Jeevan Diabetes and Endocrine Center at Kottayam now. He has been again a previous colleague in KIMS Kottayam, and was also in Caritas Hospital Kottayam. So he has been, one thing what I have noted about Dr. Jeevan is that he has quite been active in the social media, Facebook, and also has excellent communication skills when it comes to both in English and in Malayalam. So I think the key nowadays is to basically to keep the people aware about what we do. So I'm very happy and thrilled to listen to him. So going back to his academics, I think he's a member and fellow of the Royal College of Physicians of UK, and has excellent academical, excellence records on him. So I think without wasting much time, let us get on to the topic on dapagliflozin, when, where, and how. Over to you, Jeevan. So, and I think after the talk, we will have around 10 minutes to discuss a few questions or, some points we want to put out on. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Jeevan.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, for your introduction. And let me thank my senior colleagues and other people at the API who have graciously invited me to speak. And I do hope that we will be able to, cover some ground over some of which is old and some of which is new, and hopefully bring a new insight into what is a very exciting molecule. And it's not very often that we give, that I give a talk on a specific molecule, but I make no apologies for it because I think, definitely for the Indian context, I think dapagliflozin is a game changer, and we will, come to why, that is the case. We have all these molecules available here to treat diabetes, but we have seldom had a molecule which is as cost-effective as dapagliflozin currently is, along with the kind of evidence base that it has, and the kind of impact across the spectrum, both in terms of mortality and morbidity, which I think the chairperson referred to. So we all know about glycemic lowering and how the new agents stack up. You have DPP-4 inhibitors, GLP-1s, and SGLT2 agents, and you can see here that in terms of glycemic lowering, SGLT2 inhibitors are fairly potent agents, probably not as potent as GLP-1s, but they are fairly potent in terms of just lowering the blood glucose. But we know that what we want at the spectrum, when we treat the spectrum of diabetes, essentially is to ensure that we don't have a bad glycemic legacy, and therefore we risk, reduce the risk of complications. So we know that the inertia, the bad glycemic legacy that you have, are shown in the very old trials that we, or the gold standard trials that we've had, essentially tells us that if you do have poor control at the outset, then you have a much higher risk of complications down the line. And so therefore you need to have agents which not only just reduce the glycemic control, but also reduce the mortality and are reasonably safe and don't have hypos. So that's where I think SGLT2s as a class fit, because it's time to go beyond just glucose lowering. And I will try to make this interactive, but it's very difficult when you're doing just an online presentation, but hopefully you can look at it yourself. I have quite a few cases that we can go through, because it's always boring just to talk about just the theory. So here's a 55-year-old man who sees you in clinic, type 2 diabetes for 6 years, BMI of 32. You can see his HbA1c of 9.9, creatinine of 1.2, LDL suboptimal 120, urine PC ratio on the higher side at 0.25. He's on full dose of metformin, he's on full dose of vildagliptin, and he's on glimepiride 2 milligrams, atorvastatin and telmisartan, as most people are. So the question here is BMI of 32, 55-year-old chap with an HbA1c of 9.9%, no particular complications. What is the best step for him, that can deal with his, microalbuminuria kind of scenario, poor control and high BMI. And for most of these cases, there's no one size fits all, and certainly there will be different answers, and none of which is entirely correct or entirely wrong, and these are all for just for discussions. So basically what I would do in this chap, or what I did in this chap, is to half the dose of his SU and add dapagliflozin 10 milligrams. You give him counseling so that he's aware that he will lose a little bit of weight on the dapagliflozin, and also give him counseling about the other side effect, which is obviously a slight risk of genital infections. If cost is an issue, potentially you could stop the vildagliptin, because above 9% of HbA1c, a synergistic effect of a gliptin with a DPP-4 inhibitor with an SGLT2 is very minimal. And you can monitor the GRBS, and based on that, the SU dose can be titrated. So that's what I did for him. And you can see here the evidence behind that, in the trial where Saxa, DAPA, and metformin were combined and compared with DAPA and metformin, what you get additional for adding Saxa is 0.27% HbA1c change. And if your HbA1c is greater than 9%, then your HbA1c change that you get is only 0.16%. So therefore, that's the reason why I said that you could potentially stop his vildagliptin, because when you're adding an SGLT2 agent and his HbA1c is above 9%, then any synergistic effect that you're going to get from a gliptin is very minimal, and you are only increasing the cost. So potentially you could take it off, but if cost is not an issue and you wanted to continue it, then that's fine as well. So if you look at all the SGLT2 agents that are available, you have all these, and they are very similar. I'll not go through this slide in any great detail, but you can see here, if you just focus on the HbA1cs, that the drop is across the spectrum is very, very similar. So what is different for dapagliflozin in the Indian context is essentially the cost, and also the fact that it has got a wealth of, randomized controlled trial evidence and real world evidence behind it. So that's where, we would use it in somebody who has no particular complications other than, the general things that you would see in type 2 diabetes. So it has its impact on weight. I will not go through this because I'm sure that you're quite aware of it. It does have a good impact on his blood pressure as well. And so therefore, although not primarily acting as a blood pressure lowering agent, you would expect to see some blood pressure loss. Here's another case, 42-year-old man presenting to clinic. He's had MI for 3 weeks. He's already had a PCI. He was found to be diabetic at that time with an HbA1c of 6.5%. He's been started on statins, ARBs, aspirin, clopidogrel, and some metformin, obviously because he was been found to be diabetic. BMI is 26. He comes to you saying, I want a second opinion regarding my diabetes therapy. Now, what's the best move for him? Should you just leave him on what he's currently on and say that, pat him on the back and say that your HbA1c is reasonable, just do your diet, lifestyle, and metformin, and then come back to me, in 6 months' time, or should you do something different? So I would continue his metformin. I would discuss the benefits of SGLT2 for him. Here, we are not thinking about SGLT2s to lower his glycemic control, but certainly we know that using SGLT2s can improve his mortality and morbidity risk, especially because he's already had a cardiac event and has had a PCI. Empagliflozin versus dapagliflozin. If cost is not an issue, I would say that empagliflozin has an edge in terms of its hard evidence, in terms of cardiovascular risk lowering, especially because of the EMPA-REG trial. But if cost is an issue for him, then perhaps, rather not give him anything at all, you would be better off probably starting him on dapagliflozin. And how do all these agents stack up? You can see that in terms of heart failure, which is the second last one, all of them have their benefits. But as you can see here in the 3-point MACE, the gold standard studies were very strongly in favor of empagliflozin, whereas for dapagliflozin, the 3-point MACE was non-significant, although it did improve his the heart failure risk. So therefore, my view that probably in these kind of patients, if you can offer them empagliflozin, then probably it does have an edge. But having said that, if you look at the DECLARE-TIMI study, which is the study which looked at dapagliflozin, you can see that it looked at a completely different population compared to EMPA-REG. Most of these patients were actually not of the high risk category kind of patients who were there in the EMPA-REG trial. It was almost like a primary prevention trial. And you can see here that while there was a big benefit for heart failure, CV death, the MACE outcomes, the 3-point MACE was not significant for the DECLARE-TIMI study. But then if you look into the pre-specified subgroup analysis for this, if you look at patients who previously had an MI in that same study within the last 5 years, then you can see that dapagliflozin actually reduced the MACE by 16%, absolute risk reduction by about 2.6. So therefore, in this person who's already had a myocardial event, you would still have evidence to use dapagliflozin, although probably because it's a subgroup analysis, it wouldn't fall into the same criteria or the pedestal that you have for EMPA-REG. So therefore, my view that you could potentially use dapagliflozin for it. What about using DAPA in heart failure with reduced EF? I think the chairperson alluded to, most people are now using, cardiologists are using dapagliflozin in this kind of setting. So let's look at what the story actually shows us. So heart failure was reduced in the, all of this started because all these trials, the DECLARE-TIMI, CANVAS, EMPA-REG, and CREDENCE, all showed that there was a decreased risk of heart failure when you use SGLT2 agents. But DAPA-HF is actually the first trial assessing clinical outcomes even in non-diabetic individuals. So that's where DAPA-HF is actually different from the other trials. So here you can see here that there's a large proportion of people who did not have type 2 diabetes. Almost probably half the people in this trial did not actually have type 2 diabetes. And they were looking for the improvement in terms of their heart failure risks. And you can see here that the highlighted slide shows you that. And, very robustly, DAPA reduced the relative risk of, heart failure with, hospitalization, etc. by 26%. Number needed to treat is almost 21. So that is a very robust result. The question really arising from that trial is essentially, are the effects similar in non-diabetic people? Is the benefit risk ratio in the elderly the same? And are these effects on top of guideline directed medical therapy? So for example, a patient who's already on beta blockers, ACE, ARNIs, Ivabrad, does it give you added advantage? And I will just quickly go through it. If you say, if you look at the graph, the forest plots here, you can see that it doesn't matter whether the patient's diabetic or non-diabetic, you get almost very similar benefit favoring dapagliflozin. If you look at age, less than 55, 55 to 65, 65 to 74, greater than 75, in all these age groups, DAPA had a benefit. And you can see here that the green line, you can see on the right side, which is below the unity line, which is at red, tells you that it benefits across the spectrum. So does it benefit type 2 diabetic people and non-diabetic? The answer to that is yes. Is there any difference depending on the age? The answer to that is no. The benefits are very similar. If you look at diuretic use, many of these patients were on diuretics, and it doesn't matter if the patient was on less than 40 milligrams of loop diuretics, 40 milligrams or greater than 40 milligrams. You can see that the forest plots are consistently to the left. And actually, if you look at what happened to the diuretic dose, which is actually the graph that you can see on the right, you can see here that the diuretic dose, there was not much difference between, and there was no need to particularly reduce the diuretic dose because you were adding dapagliflozin. So again, robust evidence that you can very safely add dapagliflozin to loop diuretic patients who are already on loop diuretics, as long as you ensure that they're not hypovolemic at the time that you're actually adding the agent. Is it a class effect? That's the question that everybody has. The other trial which has looked at this is called the Emperor Reduced trial, looking at empagliflozin, very similar to what DAPA-HF has done. And again, it shows that the primary composite endpoint, the secondary composite endpoint are all reduced by using 10 milligrams of empagliflozin. And if you compare the two trials, very similar in terms of the number needed to treat, NNT of 19 versus NNT of 21. In the Indian context, I think the only difference is actually the big difference in the cost, which is why we would prefer dapagliflozin in this kind of setting. Here's another case, 46-year-old lady presenting to clinic, diabetic for 7 years, HbA1c of 8.6, creatinine of 1.3, glimepiride 2 milligrams, metformin 1 gram, and on twice daily insulin, BMI of 32. So suboptimal control on insulin, SU, and metformin. She's not too keen on insulin, increasing the insulin doses. So what's the best move for her? Just think about a lady present. I'm sure you have all these kind of patients presenting to your own clinics. What I would suggest, or what I did, was to reduce her insulin doses by 20%, keep her on the same dose of SU and metformin, and added dapagliflozin 10 milligrams daily, and then monitor her sugars, and then you can titrate the insulin down as per response. So essentially, only brought up this case that when you add dapagliflozin to patients who are already on insulin, just be cautious and bring down the insulin doses slightly and decide. You could potentially try to take off this sulfonylurea as well, but in this lady's case, she was quite keen to see whether she can cut down her insulin doses, and that's the reason why we did that for her. So essentially, when you combine DAPA with SU or with insulin, you have to slightly juggle around with the doses to prevent a risk of hypos. If you look at renal benefits, let me sharpen your skills with another case which makes it more relevant. 46-year-old man coming to clinic, HbA1c of 7.9, diabetic duration of 8 years. He's on metformin 2 grams, sitagliptin 100 milligrams, and huminsulin 50-50, 20 units in the morning and 16 units in the evening. Urine ACR is high at 1,200, creatinine 1.4, poor glycemic profile, EGFR 60, blood pressure is reasonable. Generally, when people come to me with very high urine ACR, I generally tend to do a few other things to make sure that I'm not missing something else. So I did an ultrasound of the kidneys, came out to be normal. I have had a few cases where they actually have a renal cell carcinoma. Serum protein electrophoresis was all right. Urine routine, sometimes very simple investigation that we miss, was all right. So the question is, what is the best step for this gentleman? I mean, his HbA1c is not that bad. It's not great, but then it's not particularly terrible. But he does have significant microalbuminuria, and we need to do something to actually reduce that and to deal with his risks. So here you need a comprehensive approach. He was not on an AC inhibitor, and that should certainly be added for this gentleman. We added in dapagliflozin 10 milligrams as well. Because of that, we reduced his, the insulin by 20%. He had, the person had poor glycemic lipid control, so atorvastatin was added. And at these kind of discussions, I initially itself warn patients that I am going to expect a paradoxical rise in creatinine, but over the long term, the damage to the kidneys will be prevented. It's very important to recognize that, because otherwise the patient will come back to you in 3 months' time and say, well, actually my creatinine is a little bit higher than what it was. And the reason for that is this, that SGLT2s, for the first time after we've had AC inhibitors, gives us a way of actually further reducing the intraglomerular pressure. I will not go through the physiology of all of this, but that does have a very beneficial impact on the kidneys. And I will show you data from the DAPA-CKD study, which kind of gives you in clear graph terms what happens. So the DAPA-CKD study, again, was done in both diabetics and non-diabetics, looking to see whether dapagliflozin can improve kidney outcomes. And it's very important to recognize that at least 14% had an eGFR in that trial of between 25 to 29 when they went on dapagliflozin. So it gives you a measure of confidence that you can use it in this kind of population. If you look at participants by eGFR and diabetes status, you can see here that almost 14.5% of the participants had an eGFR of less than 30 here, the yellow kind of pie diagram. And if you look at those people who had stage 4 CKD, almost 64% had diabetes, but then 35% of the patients did not have diabetic kidney disease. So again, just like the DAPA-HF, a study which looks at both diabetes and non-diabetic population. And if you look at the primary outcomes, very robust reduction in terms of the primary outcome. The renal composite outcomes were much better if you were on dapagliflozin. And if you look closely at this slide, it tells you what actually happens to the eGFR over that study. You can see that blue line, the blue dotted line is the dapagliflozin line. You can see that as you start it, there is a sudden sharp drop, but then it levels out and then it crosses at around 12 months. So, and then after that, patients who are on dapagliflozin are actually progressing much more slowly towards renal failure as opposed to patients who are on placebo. So it is this effect that we need to explain to patients, because otherwise they panic and they think that actually the medication has made it worse. So you need, it's at 12 months that you really see the benefits in terms of the lines crossing over, and that's I think a very important aspect to actually recognize. So dapagliflozin's long survival reduce the risk of kidney failure, heart failure, hospitalizations, and CV death in patients with kidney disease with or without type 2 diabetes. Very important to recognize this. And you can see here in this graph that whether you had type 2 diabetes or you didn't have type 2 diabetes, it made no difference. You can see that the plots are well to the left. Whether you had high levels of microalbuminuria or low levels, it made no difference. Whether your eGFR was greater than 45 or less than 45 also made no difference. So, across etiologies, across microalbuminuria cutoffs, across eGFRs, you can see a very robust reduction, very robust benefit favoring dapagliflozin. In fact, even in patients who did not have diabetic kidney disease, they had patients in the study who had IgA nephropathy and FSGS. Even in those patients, dapagliflozin benefited those patients, in terms of preserving their kidney functions. The other study that you have in this sphere, just like you have the EMPEROR reduced with heart failure, is the CREDENCE study. And the big difference between CREDENCE and DAPA-CKD as presented in the American Diabetes Association is that the CREDENCE study only looked at patients with type 2 diabetes and CKD, whereas with DAPA-CKD, you had patients who had type 2 diabetes, but also who did not have type 2 diabetes. Other than that, there's very little to pick and choose between those studies, except perhaps the cost between canagliflozin and dapagliflozin. So it's not always rosy. You do have the risk of genital infections. Potentially, if you misdiagnose somebody as type 2 diabetes when they actually have type 1 diabetes, maybe an obese 20-year-old chap or something like that, and you put them on SGLT2s, you may precipitate euglycemic ketoacidosis. But otherwise, as long as you explain the risks to patients, it's a very safe agent to use. Here's a 65-year-old man presenting with the history of diabetes for 10 years, max doses of sulfonylurea, gliptin, and metformin, and pre-mixed insulin for the last 1 year on 50 units. He has a history of prostate issues and recurrent UTIs. Urine ACR is high. Retinopathy is present. There's no obstructive features in his kidneys. Creatinine is 2, HbA1c of 9%, and erratic blood glucose readings with an eGFR of 34 mils per minute. So what's the best move here? Okay. So just think about this 65-year-old chap, max doses of SUs and metformin. He's just come to you, his creatinine is 2, and his HbA1c is 9%. And, he's got a history of prostate problems and recurrent UTIs. So I would say that in spite of all those things, he's not really a great candidate for SGLT2. I only put up this case to kind of highlight that where we need to be careful about SGLT2s and not rush in to give them in all cases. So this guy has got a history of prostate problems and recurrent UTIs. He's already running a creatinine of 2. So he's not a great candidate for SGLT2 at present. It might be in the future, but that's what I would think. And I would usually change sulfonylureas to gliclazide for renal safety because it's better to use gliclazide in renal problems when your creatinine is high rather than glimepiride. I would hold off his metformin, or perhaps you could go down to 500 milligrams once a day. His eGFR is 34. You'd be still within the guidelines to just reduce the dose of metformin. I would think that injectable GLP-1 agents would be the best agent for him because of the fact that you can use it in significant renal failure. And of course, if he's willing to have liraglutide injections, then I would stop his gliptins. Generally, when I give injectable GLP-1s, I tend to try to see whether I can go down to basal insulin rather than having premixed insulins on board. And you could potentially just calculate the basal insulin dose and give him the basal insulin, and you could give him some boluses if required. Give him close glucose monitoring. Perhaps if you're concerned, and sometimes I am concerned about patients who have high creatinine where you're significantly changing treatment, if you want to go for a short inpatient admission, well, I think that's fairly reasonable as well. And there are some patients where you do it. And then you would obviously get a nephrologist involved to look at some other aspects of his significant kidney involvement. So I will kind of wind up now because I think I've looked at most of the things that we want to discuss, but I will leave you with this kind of couple of slides that the new guidelines essentially say that if you have indicators of high risk or established cardiovascular disease, CKD, or heart failure, then you need to consider SGLT2s independently of baseline A1C, individualized A1C target, or metformin use. Just go back to the case that we discussed, somebody who had a PCI with an HbA1c of 6.5%. Irrespective of his HbA1c, irrespective of whether he's on metformin or whatever it is, he would be a candidate to consider SGLT2 agent. So that's where the guidelines have changed. We need to look at the morbidity and then decide. And similarly for CKD as well, and that applies for GLP-1s as well. Why are we talking about dapagliflozin? Because it's a tablet. It's fairly cheap now that it's come off patent, and that's the whole reason why I think it does have a big difference. I will leave you with the second last slide, which essentially shows you that in the DAPA-CKD study, there was actually a surprising reduction in patients with malignancy and infection. So most of the benefits in terms of death was from a reduced risk of malignancy. The authors themselves say that they're not sure why that is the case, and it might be something that'll become more prominent as time goes through. So let me wind up by saying that I think dapagliflozin is certainly a game changer drug in the Indian context because it's cost effective, it has glycemic control, it gives you weight loss. The DAPA-CKD study shows a number needed to treat of 19 in patients, benefit across all CKD stages and any etiology. If you look at DAPA-HF, number needed to treat of 21 in heart failure with a reduced EF, equally effective in heart failure and CKD patients with or without diabetes. So I think we've rarely had a drug that kind of ticks all those boxes and is probably around 10 rupees to the patient on a daily basis. And so for all those reasons, I think certainly we should be using more of it, and I hope we do it, but we do it safely and we don't use it at times when there's a big risk of creating problems as well. And I think the name of the game is to understand where you can use it well, and in most cases you can, and make sure that you don't use it in contexts where there might be issues. Once again, I think I've kept exactly to time, and let me thank everybody for your patient listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jeevan, for the excellent talk. And I think we enjoyed every moment of it. And I think it was quite comprehensive. Since you went through the cases, just giving us the importance of looking at the eGFR, the ASCVD scoring system. So I think just getting back to basics on how we should work up each patient on an individual basis. I think the floor is open for discussion now. I have not seen any questions coming up in the chat box. If there is anything, we can always discuss. So if anything, like I have not seen anything in the chat box. Let me start off with asking, can I?
Yeah,
Sure.
sure. Please go ahead.
Given I have a couple of comments to make. One thing is that I'm very pleased to note that the eGFR status of around 35 in the last patient which you discussed, where the metformin dose was also reduced, where, the role of SGLT2 is questionable. I think that's a very good point to make, because sometimes we start off with 35, 40, 45, the risky period of eGFR. The metformin dose still continues as 2 grams, and even with a small dose of SGLT2, we do see things going really wrong. So I think in those tricky situation of patients, I think we should be very careful. Otherwise, I think it's excellent drug to pass on. One more comment to make is that CANA 300, are we still using around there? And if so, do you observe any more weight loss benefits with the 300 milligram of CANA compared to any of the other gliflozins?
I think the randomized control trials would say that you would lose more weight, but I have hardly used 300 milligrams of canagliflozin because it's it's probably what 110 rupees or so for a patient, and I think probably you will gain another couple of kilograms in weight loss. I would say that the uptake for that in the Indian context is going to be less. Because obviously of the cost issue. But obviously, if you are, so I've used it in the UK, where just like you alluded to before when you were speaking, that the cost is not an issue and the patient doesn't pay anything. So in those kind of situations, you potentially can just go by what the evidence says.
Thank you.
Dr. Jeevan, may I ask you one question?
Sure.
Yeah, this concern, you mentioned that dapagliflozin has been used in cases where eGFR is as low as 35 ml per minute. Now, and also first few months, it tends to decline even further. What happens to potassium level? Does it remain the same or does it improve?
Most of the trials in the DAPA-CKD patients showed that there was no concerns in terms of potassium, hypoglycemia, decay, and so on. So, but I accept the point that a randomized control trial where patients are closely monitored is perhaps different from real-world settings where patients probably will disappear for months, and therefore, there's no suggestion that it actually causes hyperkalemia unless it actually causes, a big drop in creatinine. We generally with dapagliflozin tend to see only maybe about 10 to 20% drop, but that might be significant for these patients where they are on so many other cocktail of agents. So, I think your point is well made that we have to be careful when we are using it at the lower ends of the eGFR spectrum.
Thank you.
Dr. Jeevan, I'd like to.
I think we still have around 5 to disconnect.
Hear me? Yeah, Dr. Jeevan, I'm Dr. Prasanna Kumar. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I can hear you. Yeah. I would like to know about the dosage of this. It is you ensure that it is only 10 milligram is the effective doses for this, or we can reduce it to 5 milligram and see, and if required, we can increase. Anything regarding the dosage?
Yeah, I think there is no issues with using the 5 milligram dose where you are concerned about the dosing, concerned about comorbidities and seeing how it responds, and then building it up as required. So there are some patients. I mean, the smaller dose is actually recommended for people who have severe hepatic failure or severe kidney failure and so on. So it's a bit of a cautious dose. So I do use it for some people, where I am a little bit concerned, like the previous case, where there is it's a tricky situation and you don't know whether they will decompensate on it. So there's no harm in going for a lower dose and then building it up. Just like with insulin, it's better to start low and then slowly build up rather than give a massive dose and then end up with a hypoglycemia.
I think since we have time, can I ask you something more?
Sure.
Yeah. What is your recommendations on surgical days and dialysis days on, people who are on SGLT2 inhibitors?
Yeah, so people who are on dialysis, probably, the evidence for using SGLT2 inhibitors are very minimal because they certainly don't have a glycemic effect at that time. And if you're already on renal replacement therapy, what additional benefit would you be getting for, renal protection? So perhaps I would, probably stop SGLT2s if they are on regular dialysis. Because I suspect that the risks probably outweigh the benefits. Surgical patients, again, the guidance is to stop SGLT2 agents, probably 48 hours before any planned surgical procedures. And I think, most people in the post, and peri-surgical and post-surgical kind of scenario would probably not use SGLT2s and would probably just depend on perhaps insulin in that kind of scenario. But then post, pre-discharge, you could potentially start somebody back if you were happy with that their control was quite good on those agents.
Thank you.
If I may ask one more question,
Sure.
permission to chair. Dr. Jeevan, like a patient on dapagliflozin or any gliflozin for that matter, who comes with a serious condition to the medical ICU, like severe pneumonia, should he stop DAPA in such a situation?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So somebody who comes to the ICU in a very sick condition, I would take them off everything and just leave them on insulin. And the only question there is what delivery of insulin do you need? Can you get away with a basal bolus, or do you want, an insulin infusion? So there's no doubt that, because of the risk of precipitating, we know that even if you use any SGLT2, your beta hydroxybutyrate in the blood is twice your normal. So you're already slightly predisposed to become acidotic. And most infections would, severe infections and sepsis would cause acidosis by themselves. So I think I would, I would accept your point that there's no role for dapagliflozin, at least in that initial period when they pitch up on ICU.
So Dr. Sina, shall we go to the next
I
session?
think we can go to the next one, sir.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Jeevan. It was wonderful listening
Thank
to
you.
you.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, Dr. Adarshan.
Thank you, Dr. Sina, for sharing this very important session. We're very
Thank you.
grateful to you. You're doing it all the way
Always
from
welcome,
Brunei.
sir. Always welcome. Thank you.
And your experience in endocrinology also contributed to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.